host or co-host. You are automatically muted upon entering. Please mute yourself throughout the entire seminar unless stated otherwise. If you're joining us on a phone today, use *6 to mute yourself. At the end of the session, you will be invited to fill out an evaluation. Please complete this as soon as possible if you're able to. If you wish to obtain CLE credit, there will be a second evaluation to fill out. Relevant course material will be in the Google Drive. The link was provided to you in your registration email. Obtaining CLE credits, please use the registration link for information on CLE credits. An email with further information will be sent out after this training. To get CLE credit, you must attend this entire session. And please, if you're joining us, have your name on your session and respond to both polls confirming your attendance during the session. For more information, please contact Shani at sades@nylag.org. Our presenter today is Margarita Guzman. Born in El Paso, Texas, Margarita Guzman is a queer Chicana with a bachelor's degree from Georgetown University and her law degree from George Washington University School of Law. As an Equal Justice Works Fellow, Margarita established a legal clinic for indigent, Spanish-speaking mental health consumers in New York City and has since represented Latinx immigrant survivors of domestic violence in housing, family, and immigration legal matters, as well as teen and young adult survivors. In 2013, she entered civil justice at the mayor's office to end domestic and gender-based violence, Bronx Family Justice Center, until joining the Violence Intervention Program in 2017. She currently serves as an executive director at VIP, working with largely immigrant and low-income Latinx survivors of domestic and sexual violence.
Thank you so much, Integra. I really appreciate your patience reading that entire bio and really wish I'd edited it down just a little bit more. My thanks to NYU Langone and NYLAG, Columbia University, and the Office of Victim Services for hosting this incredible series. I can only imagine how much better I would have been at the beginning of my practice if I had the benefit of a 7-session trauma-informed lawyering series to benefit from. So congratulations to all of you for making time for this. It is really incredibly important work. And you have heard a little bit about me, but I would love to turn my comments a little bit to who you are, the people who are attending this training. You're people who have chosen to do legal work on behalf of indigent, exploited, and abused people. You have decided to serve the public interest and further social justice, even at the sacrifice of a larger paycheck for for-profit law. And many of you are activists and chose a legal career because you believe in righting the wrongs and in improving the lives of others around you. So you are, dare I assume it, good people. And I recognize that in many ways, this workshop session may feel a lot like I'm preaching to the choir. But don't worry, I am not here to preach. And even choirs really benefit from rehearsals. So this workshop is not going to blow your mind with brand new concepts, but our time together will give you a chance to reflect on your client's perspectives, take a minute to zoom out from the details of your day-to-day practice, and get time to think about the critically important, though thoroughly underappreciated part of your role. And that role is the role that you play in dignifying your client's experiences and validating their wholeness, instead of defining them by the legal issue that brings them to you. For a lot of us, it's so humbling to admit when we need help, and all the more when that help comes in the form of legal intervention, which can be very scary for a lot of people. For those who've been pushed to the margins by virtue of economic hardship or immigration status or skin color or gender identity, it's a real leap of faith when they reach out to call that hotline for help or to walk through your door. And so your response, therefore, must also really come from that place of humility. In fact, embracing that humility will be key in establishing successful relationships with your clients, which will in turn are going to improve the outcomes of your representation. Okay, so I preached a little bit. Let's go on ahead and move to the next slide. Thank you. And my thanks to Dr. Berry, who is so patiently going through the slides with me. I was having a technical issue, so thank you for your graciousness, participants, as we communicate about moving the slides forward. And we can go ahead and move it one slide further out. The discussion topics that we're going to be reviewing today, writ large, are building awareness and empathy, those critical muscles in being able to establish common humanity with the people that you're working with, acknowledging what you bring to the table. So making sure that as you're building your awareness of their situations, you're also moving through the relationship with a lot of awareness about yourself and how you're showing up. And finally, we want to end on building affirming attorney-client relationships. So with all that awareness, how you bring it together to have a really strong relationship with your client. If we can go to the next slide. So I would love to take a quick poll to learn just a little bit more about who all of you are. We're going to go through two polls, and the first one is, do you identify as being from a marginalized community or background? So if we can run that really quick, thank you. So just again, for anybody who might have trouble reading that, do you identify as being from a marginalized community or background? And it's yes, no, or I'm not so sure what you mean by that question. Thank you. Let's see. So 50% of folks said no, 38% said yes, and 13 coming in with a not so sure about that. Thank you so much for those responses. One more question then. For those of you who did say yes, can you, so that's 38% of the crowd. Can you tell me whether you identify with any of the following identities? And you can select as many as apply. So do you identify as somebody who is Black, Indigenous, or a person of color? Do you identify as an immigrant? Do you identify as a woman? When I say woman, I include trans women in that definition. Do you identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, or questioning? We have a lot of women identified folks on the call. About just over a third of the group is identifies as Black, Indigenous, or as a person of color. Just 15% as immigrant, and 18% as lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, questioning. Thank you so much for sharing a little bit about your identities there. And just so that we can also get a sense of who we're talking about, who's not in the room, just a few more polls. When we talk about our clients, tell me who you mean. What percentage of your clients would you say are Black, Indigenous, or people of color? And we'll run through these a little bit more quickly. What percentage of your clients would you say are immigrants? What percentage of your clients would you say are women? Again, that includes trans women. And what percentage of your clients would you say are LGBTQ+. So what we're seeing is the vast majority, I'm sorry, that the majority of folks on the call are serving a vast majority of people of color. Similarly, about half of you are serving people who are immigrants, but only 18% of you are serving a vast majority of immigrants. 60% are serving a very large majority of people who are women. And then fewer of us are serving people who are LGBTQ identified. Thank you so much for that. And I do want to note that with lesbian, gay, bisexual, like with sexual orientation, it's a much harder, unless you're asking questions specifically about people's sexual orientation, you might not have known the answer to that. So I think that that might also skew that a little bit low in some ways. And part of why I'm asking that is so that we can observe sort of the differences, right, that show up when we're thinking about how many people who identify as people of color, as women, as people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, are providing services, and then the identities of the people to whom we're providing those services are often misaligned, right? There's a lot more of us who are not identified with any of those, what we'll call marginalized identities or populations, providing services to people who are disproportionately overrepresented in those categories who are seeking our help. And I think that that's a really important misalignment or lack of alignment to be aware of. It's just one step we can take in practicing that awareness. Sustaining that awareness is going to be really key to our client relationship. So thank you for taking some time to quickly assess that and share that with me and the rest of the group. And why does it matter? Why does it matter that we be aware of our client identities? If we can move to the next slide. In the United States, at least, there is a really strong correlation between poverty and marginalized identities. Because most of us practice what can be defined as poverty law, it's really important to understand those relationships. And while we don't have time today to go over every intersection of those identities, I did want to highlight one really important cross-section and examine the impact of poverty on gender identity, especially for women of color. So in this slide, you're given a lot of helpful information. And I'm going to ask one of my colleagues on the call to plug in some the links that are connected to this slide in the deck, so that the group can see where I pulled this information from. I know we're lawyers, we really like to go to the source and see where the data comes from. In the United States, women are 36% more likely to live in poverty than men. That is such a huge differential between the experiences of men and women as connected to poverty. On the left-hand side of this slide, you'll see the national numbers that are broken down across racial and ethnic identities. And you'll see that there are increased numbers among Black, Latina, and Indigenous women living in poverty. As a point of reference for the numbers on the left-hand column, the average percentage of white men living in poverty is 7%. So as compared with some of these points, if 7% of white men are living in poverty, the comparison is that 20% of Black women nationally are, 18% of Latina women are, and 22% of Native American women are. On the right-hand side, we'll zero in a little bit more on New York State, and you'll see that there's a pretty similar differential there. But it might have even higher rates of some categories of women living in poverty than the national averages. And they're listed there for you to go on ahead and review and look at in a little bit more detail. And the link to the resource for where this comes from is in the chat for you to also reference. In New York City, coming a little bit closer to my home, the wealth gap is even greater. The poverty rate for all women and girls is 17.9%. But Black and Latina women and girls are far more likely to live in neighborhoods with higher levels of concentrated poverty, where rates exceed up to 40%. They also, in New York City, earn 25% less than white women and 50% less than white men. So what this is telling us is not just about the experiences of intergenerational poverty, when people are born into poverty. It's also telling us how hard those odds are stacked against women of color who are looking for ways out of that poverty. And that connection is something that I think is really important. And so it is not surprising when I saw your response to the poll, how many women you're representing in your day-to-day practice, right? Because women are so directly impacted by poverty. And poverty is underpinning so many of the issues that clients come to us seeking assistance for. So if we can move over to the next slide. That was all true before COVID, right? And then COVID came along. And the truth is that COVID changed absolutely nothing, even while it changed absolutely everything for our lives. It did not create any new injustices, but it did lay bare all of the pre-existing inequities in our country and attached a far more lethal consequence to those inequities. For marginalized populations, COVID-19 really only made matters much worse. For Black, Indigenous, people of color, and immigrants, especially women who are disproportionately working in industries experiencing severe job losses, it's been an economic catastrophe. For those who are overrepresented in jobs that are considered essential services, it puts us at higher risk for exposure to the virus, one of the many factors resulting in higher incidence of diagnosis and death amongst Black and Latina populations. And just one quick example, 76% of all healthcare jobs in the United States are held by women. Half of those are women of color. Here at VIP, we work with survivors of domestic and sexual violence, mostly immigrant Latinx mothers, and all of them immediately lost their jobs and spent the early months of the pandemic standing in food lines and looking for resources to feed their families. So folks who are not eligible for safety net assistance, stimulus relief, or unemployment, who truly exist outside of the margins of protections put in place for their neighbors. After 4 years of being hunted by ICE and targeted by federal government policies, being made to seem like criminals for being out of status, and people for whom the measure of good fortune was truly not being on the authorities' radar at all, it's mission critical for us to understand how that might impact the way they're showing up to the case that we're representing on, and how that's going to impact the legal strategies that might be more successful for them if they're coming to you for that assistance. And that empathy is not a soft skill. It can be the singular determinant of the success of your litigation strategies, and really make sure that you're not missing the forest for the trees. So if we can move to the next slide. Thank you. I wanted to spend a little bit of time. So it's interesting when we think about all of those factors in play and all of the many issues that come out of those lived identities and intersections of identities, it might be a little bit shocking that people don't reach out for as much assistance as you think that they might. As overwhelmed as a lot of our caseloads might be, for every one client we have, there are hundreds, if not thousands of people that we're not reaching. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time asking all of you what you think the reasons are that people might either delay services or decline to seek services in the first place. Because I know we've also gotten cases where we just wish that they had come to us sooner, right? Like they came to us at a point where the case just felt so much more complicated than it would have been a few months before when the issue first started arising. So if you can please answer in the chat, or feel free to raise your virtual hand and we'll call on you to unmute yourself if you want to share any ideas about what keeps people from reaching out for help, especially anybody experiencing the identities that we've been reviewing.
So we're getting some messages in the chat now that people feel that it might not be safe to reach out to get help, that due to past experiences having reached out or even current experiences, that it hasn't worked in the past, or that they actually have reached out and they've reached out many places, but they kind of keep getting the runaround or not getting callbacks. Language issues, lack of cultural competence when they call places, kind of immediately feeling judged or as though this isn't a safe space for them to talk. Inability to access places right now. People are referencing, the fact that we're in this current environment where to be able to access services, most people need to have access to the internet to research where services are, a phone with extended minutes to be able to make all of those calls and do all of those intakes. And then, not having community information that's actually spread widely in accessible manners about where they can actually reach out to. And then right now in the midst of COVID, I just want to also add in, people are mentioning childcare issues. How much time do people have to reach out, and to how many people if they need help?
That's right. A plethora of really wise comments, and I thank you all for sharing. I had a sort of standby list in case we didn't get a lot of responses, and you hit everything on that list and then some. I did want to uplift, one person had mentioned, you know, or a couple people actually mentioned not feeling safe or it being an unsafe situation, which is a complicated thing, can go in a lot of directions. There's a lot of ways people can feel unsafe. But one thing I did want to name is one of the things that might not feel safe is that you fear that you might make the situation worse, right? That by accessing any kind of legal assistance, you might inadvertently open the door to other institutional interventions in your life that you did not mean to invite in. For example, child protective services, immigration consequences that are unintended and not part of what somebody is looking for help around. And I wanted to note that because I think it's especially true for immigrants and people of color who are experiencing, who are assessing, you know, their safety around that. And then there was also one additional thing that I wanted to add on to all of those really great comments, and that is the concept of race-based traumatic stress. So if we can switch to the next slide. If I can get just a quick show of hands, either your actual hand or your icon hand, if you've ever heard of the phrase race-based traumatic stress. So I'm sorry, I'm just doing a really quick flip through my screens. I'm not seeing too many people respond. I have seen a couple hands.
There's about 10 showing up here.
Thank you, thank you. Just about 5% of the folks on the call. So thank you so much for sharing that with me. Then I'll start with the most obvious thing. What is it? What is race-based traumatic stress? The definition I'm offering up is a definition that is credited to Robert Carter, Dr. Robert Carter, in an article he published in 2007. And he frames it as a term used to describe the physical and psychological symptoms that people of color often experience after being exposed to stressful experiences of racism. And I'm going to repeat that one more time for folks and ask if somebody doesn't mind putting the article that I have in the deck connected to race-based trauma, understanding race-based traumatic stress, in the chat so that people can have it's a great primer. It's a really wonderful sort of summary of a lot of the research that's happened with respect to race-based traumatic stress and cites Dr. Carter heavily around it. I also want to thank the doctors at Columbia University Medical Center who shared some information from Dr. Carter with me, which just felt like an opportunity to meet a superstar virtually. So one more time, because I know it's a complicated definition, a term used to describe the physical and psychological symptoms that people of color often experience after being exposed to stressful experiences of racism. Now, that exposure does not necessarily mean that it was directed at them. Sometimes as people of color, we witness experiences of racism against other people, like identified people, and that can also contribute to race-based traumatic stress. If we can just next click, I want to also talk a little bit about how it shows up. So we've discussed what it is. The next one is how it shows up. So really similar to survivors of other types of trauma, like survivors of domestic or sexual violence, people of color often experience symptoms such as fear and hypervigilance, headaches, insomnia, body aches, memory difficulty, self-blame, confusion, shame, and guilt after experiencing or being exposed to racism. It's, as with most traumas, the more frequently you are exposed to that trauma, the more intense those symptoms can be. And the one thing I really want to note about this is that racial trauma is a cumulative experience, right? For some people, it might be one singular traumatic experience or potentially traumatic experience that contributes to some of those symptoms. For very many people, it is the lived experience over many years of many different instances of experiencing or being exposed to racism. where every personal or vicarious encounter with racism contributes to what can be a very insidious or chronic stress. And again, I am just making sure that folks know that the article from which I'm pulling a lot of this information is available for you to read. I know we're going over quite a bit, and we don't have too much time to unpack a lot of these complicated concepts. But that article does cite some really brilliant research, and I really, really encourage you to take some time to learn a little bit more about this. I wanted also, before we leave this topic, to focus a little bit on what historical race-related events, the impact that those might have in shaping how people of color view racism. Very often, for example, my mother went to school in El Paso, Texas, where I'm from as well. It's where she was born and raised as well. In elementary school, they would get physically hit every time they spoke Spanish in school. It was a requirement that all students would speak English only in school. My mother never wanted to teach me Spanish, right? Like the Spanish skills I gained after I left home, because in the home, she only wanted me to speak English to her. She didn't want me to have an accent. She wanted me to speak English perfectly. She didn't want me to get hit, right? And I said, you know, for me, of course, that was symbolic. She didn't hit me if I spoke Spanish, don't worry. But it's those sort of stories and that trauma passed down across generations that we refer to as intergenerational trauma that has its own impact on the emotional effects, and psychological wounding is a phrase from the article that we've shared with you. That is transmitted across those generations. And that, I think, is also a very, very important truth to carry with you when you're moving through conversations with people who are very likely to have the legacy of those stories and those experiences impacting the way they are now moving through the world. Because it's going to impact mental health, and certainly can even impact physical health issues, right? And I guess the last question we want to address here is, why does that matter to our work, right? Well, we learned at the very beginning that you're working with a very high percentage of clients who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color, who are women. And given the very long history of racial bias and injustice in American courts, it's a pretty safe bet that a significant number of your clients might feel triggered about past racism or actively experience racism while you are representing them in their case, right? They might actively experience racism while they're in your office, while you are walking in the courtrooms, when you used to be able to do that, even virtually it can be experienced. It will come again, you know? That courthouse experience is not lost to us. It'll return. And when it does, you can expect that even those physical walls can be activating or triggering for people who have had race-based traumatic stress. So it's so important for us to be mindful of it, because we want to be able to have difficult conversations, or it's difficult for clients to talk about those experiences. It's hard for us to ask clients about those experiences, right? There's probably very few issues in the whole world that feel more charged, more loaded, or that give us more butterflies in our stomach, our chest, our throat, than having a conversation about racism. And you can certainly dance around it or never address it. But what that could unintentionally lead to is a lack of communication, deep misunderstandings about the reasons for your client's behavior, and ultimately really eroding the trust that you're trying to build with somebody who really overcame quite a bit and took that big leap of faith that we talked about to begin with, just to call for help. So just a really quick recap, and I think we can go ahead and move on to the next slide here. Some of the things that we identified as obstacles to legal services, and I'm just a quick overview summary, was like lack of trust in the system, feeling unsafe to reach out, limited access to attend appointments, right? So transportation, childcare, maybe you're working, The technological capacity to do so, having the minutes, being able to find a confidential place to have all these interviews and intakes, fear that you're going to make the situation worse, that your decisions are going to be treated poorly or questioned, and then race-based traumatic stress. How is it that we overcome some of those things, right? How do we mitigate? What are some of the actions that we can take? Really practical things, big and small, because of course we all want to end racism. But in your intake that you have scheduled for 3 o'clock this afternoon, for example, what are some of the things, presuming that we don't end racism between now and then, what are some of the things that we can do to mitigate some of those challenges and really help to create a stronger bond with our clients? And I would love, again, to hear from folks in the chat and invite people to raise your virtual hand, and you might get called on if there's a little bit of time to do that.
So as people are typing or figuring out the tech to raise hands, I can say that some things that are being mentioned is making sure that everything isn't in legalese. Really take a big step back to think about, you know, this is somebody that maybe didn't engage with the system or perhaps has and may have had their own experience of it, and walk them through the process. People are saying acknowledge them. I think it's so important that when people say to you, like, you know, they're against me, something happened and it's because I'm a person of color, that you don't jump over that. You really need to be able to acknowledge that is a thing. Otherwise, you're shutting the door to continue to have that conversation. Raise uncomfortable issues by naming them if you feel like somebody's perhaps talking around something. Inviting them, you know, noting from the outset that, you know, I'm going to be listing the process. I'm going to be talking through options. Not all of these are the right ones for you. And I understand that. I just want you to have an idea of what's out there, and really giving them the agency to understand that you're not prescribing that they have to do the things that you're kind of advising them to do next. And really just be open with conversations and preparing for court related matters or any type of interview with an official about, you know, racism, sexism, and how somebody's sexual or gender identity might have been used against them in the courtroom, versus, you know, what might happen. Just kind of really having open experiences about that. I know I had one specific case where there was a judge who was very, very, very openly a misogynist and saying, you know, really anti-queer comments. And the first thing I spoke about when I left the courtroom, besides what I did in the courtroom, is to sit down with the client, acknowledge that, apologize for the fact that this was happening, and sit with that before we turned to anything else.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that experience. That immediate intervention right after that, walking out of that experience and having somebody immediately validate what they just went through, and that was, you know, like identifying how problematic it was and that it was not okay, does so much. It does so much to redirect and to not just to help them feel more connected to you because you're the person who's doing that, but to also have some faith that there's people who are going to fight that with them, right? That they're not alone in that fight, that they're not alone to carry that. So critically important in helping to offset the impact, the harmful impact of what happened right then and there, and also solidifying your relationship with the client. And I love all of the comments that people were offering up, taking the time, being sure you're doing that. And I imagine also that when I was listening to that, I can also sort of hear, like, yeah, because we all have time for that, right? Because we are rushing from interview to interview, intake to intake, court to court. And we always have the time to sit and unpack. You know, the truth of the matter is, if we don't take that time, we find ourselves in a position where we're going to have more work in the long run, right? When you're not taking the time to create those connections, understand where your client is coming from, ask those critically important questions, you're going to find yourself in a place where you lack information. And that's going to mean that you just can't move the case forward the way you need to because you don't have the information that you otherwise need. We'll talk a little bit more about some of the impact of not acknowledging those things a little bit later. And I also just want to lift up the ever important practical assistance, right? Getting people Metro cards or transportation fare, making sure that you're talking to your organization about what childcare might be available whenever possible. And when that's not available, then planning with your client, part of your meeting with your client is to talk about what those practical obstacles might be and troubleshooting that along with them, right? So planning for all those practicalities, who's going to take care of the kids while we're talking? If they can't take care of the kids in your home, is it possible to come to the office with them when, again, we're doing all of that? But making sure that you're meeting with them during hours that are accessible to them and not just on your schedule. Making sure that there's some flexibility around all of that really goes a long way. So I just wanted to name some of those practical solutions as well. And wanted to spend a little bit more time with Dr. Robert Carter, the person who really did coin and start so much of the early research around race-based traumatic stress. Because when it comes to mitigating, I'm just going to now acronize it, so Rbts, it's so important that you can't, to know this, and this is part of Dr. Carter's wisdom, that you can't undo somebody else's experience of racism. Right? And it's not your job to make them feel better about the racism, right? It sounds to me like in Shani's example, they walked out of a courtroom and Shani said, that was messed up. That was not okay. Like, are you okay? She didn't say it's gonna be okay, or it's okay, the judge isn't really like that, or don't worry, like don't, or shake it off, right? Like that wasn't her reaction. And I think that's really important to highlight. Because empathy is not about trying to make somebody feel better about their situation. It's about acknowledging how difficult that situation is and sharing that understanding. That's what empathy is. And that's what we're looking to build. So let go of the notion that you might need to make them feel better. It's also uncomfortable because you have to sit with their pain and discomfort, and it might cause you pain and discomfort to do that. But that's some of the difficult stuff that we really need to lean into. Dr. Carter had given some assessment tools to mental health professionals to gauge the impact of Rbts on people of color. And he also offered 3 key practice points for therapists to explore with their patients. And I thought that those were really relevant here. So again, another moment of gratitude to Columbia University for sharing some of this information. But Dr. Carter noted that the first and foremost thing you can do is to see and understand, right, how race might influence the client. And some of the ways that this might show up, right, is why does your client constantly miss your appointments or fail to return your calls? Why are they showing up chronically late to different things, right? That could be avoidance manifesting in your client's experiences of Rbts or of a traumatic stress related to anything else, right? It's not just that your client doesn't think this is important, right? If they're facing homelessness or the potential separation with their children or immigration consequences or potential incarceration, you can trust and believe that they know how important this is, right? It's not about whether or not your client thinks it's important or whether they truly appreciate what's going on here. Of course they do. Their behavior might have a lot more to do with traumatic stress symptoms showing up, right? The second thing that Dr. Carter noted was to learn about the participant's life circumstance, right, and background, and ways of responding to their environment. So you can ask, I've noticed that you've been late to the last couple of meetings. Don't worry, I'm not bringing that up because I'm upset or trying to, tell you that you have to change it necessarily. I just want to know what you think is causing that, so that we can go through what, so that I understand. And as, that if we both understand, then maybe we can make some better adjustments moving forward. When you ask your clients about their court history, we ask our clients about their history for a case, right? So in a family court case, you might ask, like, is there a pre-existing visitation order? You're asking about the history of the case. Please also consider how important it is to ask them about their past legal experiences and how that felt for them, right? So when you got that divorce order issuing, XYZ. How did that make you feel? You know, what was your experience of the court at that time? And they might share, right, whether they found it to be an empowering or a very disempowering experience, or even discriminatory, or if they felt unheard. And now you'll know, right, what had come up for them. And you can ask them, how can I support you if some of those bad feelings come up again, right? And you've had a quick conversation already on the potentiality that some stress symptoms might show up. And you've already asked them how you can respond to it. Because in the moment of those stress symptoms coming up, it's so much easier to say, when we first talked about this, you said it would be helpful for me to take you aside and have just a quick breather with you, or to let you go outside for a couple minutes. Is that something that sounds like you might need right now? Let's go on ahead and do that, you know? And you're not just creating that breather or that space for them, you're also reminding them of their agency and their own wellness, right? So like, it's not just you telling them, let me take care of you, this is how I can take care of you. You're reminding them that they know how to take care of themselves, and they're the ones who taught you, right? Which is an empowering moment to have, even in a really stressful context. So I thought that was really key, making sure you learn about your participants' life experiences. And then the last thing that Dr. Carter shared that I wanted to share with you is that a lawyer's life, well, a therapist, but I replaced it with lawyer. The professional's life experiences and training might lead you to miss the issues or discount the racial issue or to change the topic, right? You're so involved in the history, the legal history or the precedent connected to the merits of your argument. And you're focused on your training. That's what you're there to do. That's what you're bringing. But you might miss what's important to the client in those moments, right? So while you're trying to get information, data, or history connected to what might make a strong argument legally, you want to be sure that you're taking the time to hear from the client what it is.
I already have everything ready.
So sorry. I'm just going to pause really quick. Are we muted? Great. Thanks, whoever just muted yourself. I appreciate it. So it just because it's one of our blind spots, and it can be one of our blind spots. And it also might be something that we discount, not because we don't believe it's real or important, but because we just don't know that we can have the time, energy, or skill set to unpack that, right? But again, like in the example that Shani shared, she wasn't unpacking all of the history of misogyny on the planet. What she was saying is that wasn't okay, that was messed up, and then you moved it forward, right? But to not have talked about it would have been a really big problem. And it's really simple, you know? We can be part of the solution, or we might continue to inadvertently be part of that problem. So if you fail to spot or understand the impact of Rbts, you're missing a critically important part of your client's experiences and potentially replicating, even microaggressively, some of that racial harm. So I'm gonna pause there because I believe Shani has something to tell y'all.
Thank you, Margarita. So I put another link from Margarita that talks about regarding resources for addressing racial trauma in the chat as well. But at this moment, we're going to do our first CLE poll. So everybody that is here and requesting CLE credit, the poll should be on your screen now. I'm going to leave this up for a minute. Remember, if it's not showing on your screen, it might just be hidden behind another window. And just a brief reminder for those of you who do want CLE credit to please, if there's no safety or privacy issues, make sure that your name on the Zoom account references is the name you want your CLE certificate in. Otherwise, email me afterwards to let me know what your name was here. So I'm going to leave this up for 30 more seconds. Thank you. All right, thanks everybody.
Okay, thank you, Shani. I just wanted to close that out really quick, and then I think now would be a good time for a quick 5-minute break. But before we go into that break, just wanted to note, there's so much that we're discussing, and I know that it's at a pretty high level. And I wanted, because I feel also, I can tell that in this room, there's a lot of folks who are real high achievers and who really want to do right by I know everybody wants to do right by their clients. And I want to note also how important it is to have some graciousness too for yourself. There's no such thing as taking a training and then getting it right. Everything is about practice. And so it's perfectly fine that in your practice, you'll make mistakes. What we're inviting you to do is to acknowledge those mistakes, acknowledge them in the way that might make the most amount of sense to the person that you're working with, to the extent that it's relevant and helpful to them. And then really to just continue learning, right? We can't get so caught up in the mistakes that we make that we can't move past them. And again, that we make mistakes doesn't mean we're bad people. Pretty sure this is a crowd of really good folks. But it does mean that we can always be getting better and we can always be getting stronger. So especially for folks who are sort of at the outset of their legal career, mistakes is part of how we move forward. And this is hopefully some time to sort of reflect on what some of our engagement has looked like and how we can strengthen that. So after the break, we'll come back and talk a little bit about what practices might look like. But I'm going to go on ahead and stop there, and we'll come back at 12:55. Does that work? Yeah, okay, great. Thank you, everybody. Okay, everybody. I'm going to give it just another few seconds for people to finish getting your tea, your coffee, your lunch, feeding your kids. Or if you made my mistake responding to that last work email, nothing to get your head out of the game like checking your work email. Okay. Thanks for coming back, everybody. And thank you so much for all of the participation. It is still really weird to talk to 100 some odd screens, most of which are names over black screen, which is no shade at all. Just it's a difficult thing as somebody who's doing the communicating. So thank you so much for your participation and your feedback. It really helps keep me energized too. Okay, so our last hour together. We're going to start out with the most incredible phrase. I feel like this phrase so shifted so much for me. And I really do think of myself as somebody who has a pretty in-depth anti-oppressive lens and a political analysis around it. But if there's anything the last year has taught us, it is that we are not doing enough and we all need to be doing better. Yeah, so please go ahead after the 5-minute break is great. And that phrase is radical reorientation. And some of you might recognize that. It comes from Ibram Kendi's How to Be Anti-Racist. And I am just going to read this quote because I think it is so phenomenal. Racist ideas have defined our society since its beginning and can feel so natural and obvious as to be banal. To be an anti-racist is a radical choice in the face of this history, requiring radical reorientation of our consciousness. Oh, that was one of those like mind-blown moments to me, the idea of a radical choice in the face of our history, that when we choose to be anti-racist, that requires a radical reorientation of everything we understand, like our entire consciousness, was such an incredible invitation to me, and something that I really wanted to share with everybody else. It is the invitation that I think underpins this entire training series, right? And it's within that radical space that we can really start to do some transformative work together. So I offer it as the framework for this last hour, and want to spend some time now with you talking a little bit, going a little bit more introspective to ourselves. We've talked a lot about sort of institutional and social harms and thinking a little bit more of our roles in these systems. In fact, we can go to the next slide because I think that's the title of that slide. Yes, our role in the system. It is so important for us. We are officers of the court, right? And we are there to navigate, not necessarily deconstruct every single appearance that we have when we're there. It's so important for us to be aware of our connection to the problem and its involved institutions, right? So as officers of the court, even if you don't like it, you're part of the system, right? Like, even if we're here to fight and change that system or to do better by our clients within that system, we're still part of it. It's important for us to know it because our clients know it, right? They're very aware of how much of a part of that system we are, and we need to be as well. What's more, your client is coming to you, right, at a moment when they're facing some kind of a crisis, a conflict, or a challenge, and they're not exactly happy to see you, right? Like, you're the last person they wish they had to be interacting with. They wish they didn't have this problem. So you're not necessarily going to come with a positive association for them, right? And I think it's important to be mindful of the fact that it's not personal, right? That they're meeting you under terrible circumstances, would rather not have to meet you at all. And you probably feel the same way. You wish that they weren't in the position that they are in, but you're there to help. So I think that I wanted to also just note that right off the bat, in some ways, you might kind of feel like you've been made guilty by association, or if you're not aware of it, it's something to be aware of, that your client might see you as part of the problem and not necessarily part of the solution at first. You know, when I was doing a lot of tenant anti-eviction work for tenants in housing court, You know, in housing court, you just see the same landlord attorneys all the time. You end up building some sort of relationships with them, right? Some more antagonistic than others. Some can actually be somewhat friendly. And my clients, I realized, were watching that, right? And for some of them, it was upsetting to them to see that I was getting along with the landlord's attorney. To others, they were like, oh, great, you know that guy. Like, we're in, we're all right, you know? Either way, having to explain what the reality was behind that, behind those relationships, was really rooted in me understanding that I was not separate from all of that to them. I was part of it. And I'm there, you know, in my role, can inadvertently reinforce a lot of the procedures and processes that were not made with marginalized communities in mind. So being mindful of how we might replicate inadvertently. And some practice points that I have around that. And I would love also if while we're going over this, people would share in the chat anytime that you felt that, right? That your client was like, oh, wait, I don't know. Are you one of them? Because I thought you were supposed to be here for me. Or where you kind of experienced that. I'd love to hear any shares that people have. And while you're doing that, I just want to go over some practice points around this. So I think it's really important to acknowledge from the very beginning what I had just said, right? Like, I understand that you might, you know, that the last thing you want to do right now is take time off of work or leave your kids with somebody else to come talk to me about this difficult issue. And I'm so sorry that we're meeting under these circumstances, right? In a better world, you wouldn't be in this position at all. I feel like that really off the bat gives your client an understanding that you see, that you're not just seeing them as part of your work, that you're seeing their reality here. And in addition to asking all of the relevant case history, and this is something we had talked about a little bit earlier, asking them about their prior experiences with courts, judges, lawyers. We had talked about it earlier in the context of asking them about whether or not they experienced any sort of institutional or court-related bias respect to their racial, ethnic, or gender presentations. Their racial, ethnic identities or gender presentations, or sexuality, or class experience, or ability, right? So that's what we were talking about earlier. The addition I have here to that, asking about history, is also asking if they had a prior lawyer and how their relationship with that lawyer was. Did the lawyer say or do anything that made them feel uncomfortable? Is there anything that they think would make this relationship, this experience, much stronger, right? Because if they've had lawyers before, then they can probably give you a tip or two off the bat about how to connect with them, right? So be sure that you're asking them for that information, you know, like, how did that relationship go? Did you feel it was strong? If it was strong, what made it strong? If it wasn't so strong, what do you think that we could do better here this time around, right? And I think also that if it's relevant, it's worth it to draw distinctions between what they went through before and what they're going through now, right? That won't always be the case. It might in fact be that you're representing them in a case that's much worse than what they had dealt with in the past. But if there is a distinction to draw between what created the really powerfully negative imprint, impact, or trauma that they experienced from that prior court case, then being able to say how it's different now can be really helpful as well, right? At least it can help orient them to how this might be a different experience, or at least open their thoughts to the fact that this might be different from what it was before. And I'll pause there to see if there were any shares in the chat, because I'm not able to see that from here.
Yes. So some things that came through in the chat were just talking about, you know, giving advance notice, being really transparent with clients. If you know that there's a jurist or an opposing counsel with certain types of demeanor, in a way that doesn't, you know, not an attempt to scare them, but to kind of give them advance notice, know that you're going to see it too, give them kind of that heads up. There were some things that came out where people say that they really do feel a lot of tension in the when doing advocacy. One person mentioned when they're doing advocacy with law enforcement, but also with other parts of the court, that, you know, they want to show their client that they're there on their behalf and advocate. But we also recognize that a lot of our systems and the individuals in the system like to be spoken to with as if they have the authority, right? Like they want you to show that you're respecting their power. and how that can play when a client's observing that can be really challenging. And maybe, you know, taking time to set spaces to explain to the client how you're going to be navigating the conversation and why, you know, strategize which parts of the conversation you're doing all together and which parts of the conversation you're doing separately, and then coming back together in general to talk. And there was one other comment. I tried to write things down so I could remember them rather than scroll. I apologize. But to also pay attention to how often we are kind of buddying up with people in the courtroom or talking off the record about cases. And really, you know, somebody mentioned a strategic thing of just sit with your client. It's less likely that perhaps the DA on that case or opposing side on that case is going to come joke around with you. You know, there's time for pleasantries, and there's times that you can, you know, build the relationship you might have with them separately. But that when you're in court and waiting for your case to be called, maybe that's when you sit with the client specifically and you know, make sure that you're folding them into off the record conversations that are happening, so they're not wondering if what you're talking about with everybody is them, if it's not.
That's right. That's right. It makes so much sense that if you're talking to all these people in the room and you're representing them on a case, that they're going to believe you to be talking about them or their case, right? And so helpful for them to have the inside track with you, to know that you're going to be transparent about those conversations. Does so much to ameliorate the anxiety that they might not ever want to tell you about, right? Like they're not good. Not everybody will be comfortable saying, like, were you talking about me? Or presuming so. So it's so helpful to offer that up on your own without waiting to be asked, because you might never be asked and you might never understand the impact it could have on somebody if they feel anxious about that. There was an earlier comment there about, oh, and now I'm losing track of it. I wish I had written it down as well. But it did remind me of a regular practice I had, depending, you tend to know your judges, or, you know, if you do your due diligence and you ask people what the judge is going to be like if you've never practiced before them. So there was one particular judge in family court that I would always tell my client, I was like, listen, I'm going to get yelled at. It's totally okay, right? Like, I'm not going to be upset. The judge is going to yell. It has nothing to do with the strength of your case. The judge may yell at me directly, and it's not about me at all, right? This is part of how the judge acts. And then it always happened, right? That judge always yelled. And I think that many times you'd come out of the courtroom and the person would be like, oh, I'm really glad you told me that they were going to do that, you know, or I didn't think that you were serious, but wow, that person does yell at everybody, huh? As we're walking out, they could hear them yelling at somebody else, right? Because it helped them to understand that it wasn't all going to end very badly for them necessarily in that moment, or because of that reason. So I think it's so important to be able to share things like that. Other things, right? I'm sorry to be pulling so much on family court right now, but now in that vein, whenever you're going to go into a court conference, if there's a conference room, right, describing what that room might be like ahead of time, where you might position yourself, I would always make sure I was positioned sort of in a place where I can be between my client and anybody else in the room, not because I was necessarily always worried about there being any physical contact, though in domestic violence cases where we're all being forced into a conference room no matter what against our objection, that would certainly potentially be the case. But just even describing to your client the physical location of your body, right? Like, I will put myself here. Where would you like to sit in the room? A lot of people prefer to sit by the door if that's an option, for a host of reasons, or want to be able to see the door for a host of reasons. So making sure that you're talking about even the physicality of what the courtroom might look like is really important in helping to demystify and to, somebody had in an earlier comment had said, don't do the legalese, right? Yeah, so to translate that for people. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. And then if we can move over to the next slide. I feel like an important thing for us to talk about, right? Like, privilege is the pink elephant that is in every single room, and it is always in the room. And this is certainly not a training on privilege and oppression. And I know that these, again, are complex concepts, but I will offer a definition of privilege for the purposes of this conversation. And that is brought to us by Justin Garcia in his article, Privilege and Social Inequality. And it is privilege refers to certain social advantages, benefits, or degrees of prestige and respect that an individual has by virtue of belonging to certain social identity groups. Within American and other Western societies, these privileged social identities of people who have historically occupied positions of dominance over others includes white people, males, heterosexuals, Christians, and the wealthy, among others. Okay, so certain social advantages, benefits, or degrees of prestige and respect that you get automatically just because you belong to a certain social identity group. That's the definition of privilege, the working definition of privilege that I'm relying on for the purposes of this conversation. Though I know that there are lots of different definitions of privilege, and you're welcome to share additional definitions that you think are important, or if you think that definition missed anything critical in the chat. We won't take time to review it, but I do think it's important for you all to see each other's definitions of privilege as well. One of the most amazing functions of privilege, it's just like magic. It can't see itself, right? Privilege has the privilege to not have to ever be aware of itself. So we walk in our skins, we express our genders, we embody many identities, some not always visible, and so do our clients. But very often for people who are wearing any visible identities of racial, ethnic, gender, etc., ability, those are things that we don't get to forget about, right? I am never not aware of the fact that I'm a brown woman when I am walking in the world. I sometimes forget that when I'm here at home, like with my cat, right? Doesn't care. But the second I walk out the door, those identities are something that I am made abundantly aware of. Privilege doesn't always have to be aware of itself in any way. So it's so important for us to unpack a little bit of what that privilege might look like, and be aware that it's always there, even when we're not aware of it, especially when we're not aware of it, actually. Ignoring our privilege can really run into a lot of risks. And that's something I do want to make sure we spend some time talking about, either in the chat or go ahead and raise your hand to ask to be unmuted if you prefer. I'm a terrible typist. I'd always rather unmute myself, but you should include it in the chat if you prefer. So anytime you're working with somebody who doesn't share your identities, that difference is really present. If you're part of a dominant group and your client is not, that's going to contribute to your client relationship dynamic. Pretending that it doesn't can run a lot of risks. So I want to turn the question to the group and ask, what are some of the risks you're running by not acknowledging your privilege when you're meeting with your clients?
People are saying insensitivity, a direct impact on the attorney-client relationship and ability to proceed. Even privilege, just in terms of like, oh, I can do multiple meetings and it's not a big deal because this is my job. I don't have to pay for a Metro card. That doesn't have an impact on me. I don't have to navigate childcare or taking off work for the day. And assuming that those impacts don't exist or wouldn't be hard for another individual. People that are less likely to open up for fear of being judged because not acknowledging, I think somebody said something like about this before, but we've spoken about it in other trainings, that not acknowledging is also a statement, right? And so by not acknowledging certain things, that people might feel afraid of saying certain things, being judged, feeling as though you might be defensive, possibly committing microaggressions against the client without even realizing that you're doing it. Not recognizing that the power dynamic that's inherently present in the fact that we are people that are a part of the system may make clients not feel that they're able to tell us negative things about the system, or ask questions that they think are, silly. Also how they might value our advice. If they think our advice is coming from a place of privilege for people of privilege only, that they may not think that we're really taking into account that, everybody's lived experience, including theirs, is very different from our own. And somebody here says, I just want to state the word, it's implicit dishonesty.
Ooh, what a great phrase, implicit dishonesty. Thank you for that one. I really appreciate that phrase. I'm going to write it down really quick. Yeah, absolutely, right? If your client doesn't see you working to understand them. Why on earth would they have faith in your advice if it doesn't seem like you have any real context for what they are going through or the decisions that they have to make, which isn't just, you know, a legal decision. That is going to implicate so many other decisions that they have to live with and that they have to live with, right? Not you. So seeing that you are doing the work to understand all of that and the long-term implications of this is really goes a long way towards addressing that privilege and really uplifting your client, right? Want to add just diminishing their decision making, right? When that privilege works even in a way that comes out that might play out as a sort of benevolent paternalism, right? Like, oh, well, this person, you know, like, sure, they have a lot of privilege, but they're there for me and I know that they care about me and they're helping me make good decisions, or they're making the good decisions. That really does have the inadvertent impact of diminishing their decision making. This is something that comes up a lot, you know, especially when I was representing people who were Latina, who were immigrant, who are monolingual Spanish speakers. They wanted very often, not all of them, of course, but it was a really common theme in my representation with that, that demographic, that people asked me what they should do, right? What advice do I have for them? What did they think what did I think would be the best way to go? And acknowledging that all the privilege that goes into that, right? The way that I speak English, the fact that I'm a lawyer, the fact that I'm a citizen, right? Which they maybe didn't know, but were assuming, and is true, right? It was an actual privilege of mine. There was just so much, right? I'm employed, I get to wear the suit, you're in street clothes, right? Like all of these things that indicate our privilege are in the room and can really impact our clients' ability to make their own decisions. And where does it put us as their lawyer if they're not confident in their own decision making, right? And so all of the great suggestions or all of the great feedback that people just put in the chat, that was all really great to hear. And thank you again for implicit dishonesty. I really appreciate that phrase. I'm gonna marinate on that concept a little bit. And somebody else had written that it's not going to help your case, right? Like it might inhibit their willingness to share key information that could really impact the case. How we address that difference now is key to the relationship or collaboration that we build with that person. So it doesn't mean that you have to, you know, there's nothing if you're working with a client and you're part of privileged identities that they are not, there's a pretty small universe of options available, right? But they're key options that you can be taking, right? So you might not be able to change your whiteness, change your gender presentation, or want to, or change, you know, and you certainly aren't going to change the fact that you're the lawyer in the room. But you can address all of that in a way that makes it clear to the client that you're aware of that and that really uplifts their decision-making, their agency. And that is what's critical, right? Like it's not in this relationship where you are going to solve privilege and oppression. It is where you are going to address it in a way that doesn't replicate oppression that that person would experience by you, right? And that's what's key. That's what you have control over there. Otherwise, we are, again, just parts of that system and potentially perpetuate the oppression of that legal system, and as all of its actors and officers might. So some practice tips that we have here, in addition to the ones that were offered in the chat, which were all very wise. Just never assuming that you understand somebody's life experience, right? I think at the very beginning of my bio, it says I'm a queer Chicana. Depending on where the bio is, I also am a survivor of intimate partner violence. Doing work with other Latina survivors of intimate partner violence can make it really easy to just want to shorthand experiences or think, yeah, well, I know what that's like. Or also just because we've all been through trauma in a lot of different ways, want to be seen there too, right? It's so important to recognize that this is not the relationship necessarily where you get to address your own trauma, right? Like it's so important, even if you have similar life experience, that you are creating space for the client, and that you are thinking about how you create space for yourself to deal with how that might impact you afterward, right? but your client may not be the best person to try to work out those issues for yourself right then and there. Never assume that what you would do in a given situation would work for the client, right? You never want to inadvertently or benevolently replace their decision-making with your own because you don't live their life. You don't exactly know how it would work out for them. And in that vein, you really want to affirm, right? You want to affirm and honor their life experience and affirm that it is unique, that you will not always understand what they have been through, but you will always honor what they share with you, and that the decisions that they make are something that you are going to work towards actualizing, right? So making sure that you're saying that, and that you repeat that throughout, not just in the intake, but that they are seeing that you're demonstrating that, and that you're mentioning it as you go is really important. And we had talked about this earlier, but apologizing when you make a mistake is really important. I was working once with a client who was transitioning her gender during my representation. And so during that representation, I started using one name and ended using a different name. And in that process, there were multiple times where I'm gonna be honest and say I misgendered that person, right? And I think that that's something that I look back on quite a bit with regret, but also I look back on it and think about the way that I handled it and how I could have handled it better. One of the things that was really difficult for me is, especially as a queer identified person, I just couldn't believe I was misgendering her, right? Like I was so angry at myself. I was so angry at myself for doing that. I know better than this. Aren't I supposed to be some radical lawyer? What is going on with me? And I was so mad at myself that I made it about myself and I didn't make it about her. So when I would make this awful mistake, I could feel myself going flush and I could feel myself getting angry at myself. And to this day, I don't know if she thought I was angry at her, right? I don't know if she thought that my energy was shifting because she had done something wrong or I was perceiving something wrong. And I wish what I had just done was and I did apologize every time I did it, but I apologized almost in this like, oh, I'm so mad at myself way. I wish I'd just apologized in a way that centered her and not me. I wish I would have just apologized for the misgendering and worked harder, of course, but having a genuine apology in the moment, I think, would have been a very different experience for her, and one that I really wish I had that one back, you know? So there's absolutely nothing wrong with acknowledging when you do something wrong. It's when we don't that the wrong can really start to compound. So on that note, we can move forward to the next slide. And I wanted to take a little bit of time here to have a little bit of opportunity for all of you to do some self-reflection, right? The reflection is going to be focused on thinking about a time when something negative was assumed about you based on your identity or identities, whatever those might have been, that wasn't true. So just an assumption that somebody made about you, a negative one, that wasn't true and that was based on one of your identities, visible or not visible. And what we're going to do for this reflection exercise is we're just going to take 3 to 5 minutes. I am an old-fashioned kind of pencil to paper kind of gal, so I would use this time to pull out a, to pull out a piece of paper. People still might have those, and just start jotting down some thoughts about it. You can just type something to yourself, in an email that you're never going to send. You can draw. You can just sit and think about it, whatever makes sense for you. But I do want you to think back to that time and take a few minutes to answer. And here's some guiding questions that you can answer, right? How did it show up, right? Like, how was it that that assumption was made? And how did it make you feel? Was it ever addressed in any way? And if somebody did try to address it, how did that go, right? If it was never addressed or if it didn't go well, what would have been an affirming way for it to have been addressed? So that's a lot of questions. You can answer all of them or none of them, as long as you're reflecting on that moment and the impact it had on you. That's the goal here. And I want to take, can we do 5 minutes? How many minutes do we recommend, Shani?
I think based on where we are with this, how about we give everybody 4?
4 minutes. See, the
1:30.
slide gave you 2, so we doubled your time, everybody. Great, so 4 minutes to 1:30. And I'm gonna go ahead and mute myself and stop talking now so you can reflect. Oh, 4 minutes really flies. Go ahead and just finish that last thought. Thank you. Thank you for taking the time to do that. You know, one of the things I had mentioned at the very beginning is that we weren't going to have any like brand new amazing concepts. So maybe some of them have been new for some folks, but just time to reflect. We lose that so quickly in our practice, you know, so quickly it becomes about a very regimented schedule, and we don't always have some time to just think about how it's personal for us too. So I really appreciate that you took the time to do that, and thank you. If in this vast room of 100 some odd people, anybody wants to share that experience, I would love to hear one, maybe two if we have time for it. You can feel free to put it in the chat, and there is zero pressure to share. It's a share. We can certainly move forward. But I did want to create some space for people for whom that might feel like a really great affirming thing to do. And if it doesn't feel good or affirming, then I really don't encourage it. But I'll give a few seconds to see if anybody wants to share that story.
So somebody did share in the chat. I don't want to speak for them, but I don't know if they want to remain anonymous. So I'm going to say what's in the chat, and if that person wants to add more, please just unmute yourself and do so, but no pressure if you prefer it to be anonymous. In court, it was assumed that I was an angry Black mother trying to take a child away from his father. This was based on the climate that family court has when it comes to domestic abuse cases, deemed high conflict cases, very dismissive of abuse and manipulation.
Oof. Oh, thank you for sharing that. And wow, anybody who's been in family court has just seen the great intersection of oppression on display. And absolutely, I feel like those are misogynistic and racist tropes that very much influence decision-making at all levels. And, you know, starting at security to get through the door all the way through to the very end. So I am, lo siento, and I am sorry that that was your experience. And that those assumptions get made is something that is always really challenging, especially for attorneys of color who are navigating our own, in addition to our clients' experiences of all these intersectional oppressions. I was thinking also of a time, and I don't know if there, do we have time for one other share, Shani, if anybody did share?
I have one other, and again, same thing. I don't know if the person wants to remain anonymous. If not, please feel free to unmute yourself, but I'll read what's in the chat so you know who I'm referring to. In private practice, I worked in an all-male firm, and a male client came in for a consult and asked to see the lawyer. I indicated I was the lawyer, and they asked to see the other lawyer. And I told my boss that they should still let me do the consult. And they told me to tamp down the drama and show the client in, laughed, and then asked for coffee.
Wow. I mean, we can't make that up any more offensively than it played out, right? Wow. Thank you for sharing that. And, you know, it's, I feel like very often we presume these experiences to be of a different time, of a different like era, of different colleagues. And it's so important for us to remember. I remember being in law school and being in a class about gender and sexuality and talking about rape. And we were talking so much about the people who caused that, or about people who experience that harm. And never once was it acknowledged that there might be people, and then, you know, there was a lot of knowledge about people in the room that might have experienced it, which I appreciated. But they never acknowledged that there might be people in the room who caused that harm, right? Like, we really assume that the people around us are not harmful actors. And we really ascribe that harmful acting to a different place, a different location, a different time, in ways that really do continue the work of letting privilege not see itself. So those shares, I think, are really powerful because they ground us very much in the actualization of those problems here and now and in our lives. So thank you, people, for the shares, those shares, and I'm sure that there's many more. And I just want to see that and acknowledge it, and thank you for bravely sharing that. I wanted to sort of, as we navigate away from this, connect that, right? That we have personal experiences that are not totally separate, or at least are on the same spectrum of experiences that our clients are going through, right? We might even have very similar life experience to what our clients are going through, right? We may have been in family court. We may have been fighting for custody. We may be survivors of domestic violence. We may have all of these similarities. And even in those instances, it's so important to still remember that when you're the lawyer representing a client in this context, you are still a person with a privilege that your client doesn't have, right? You're the lawyer. And not to presume your client isn't a lawyer, your client may very well be, but in that moment, you have some privilege as a gatekeeper to these services, as a gatekeeper to the outcomes that somebody is hoping to achieve. And that is sort of the pink elephant that is in the room with us at all times. And it's a pretty full room. There might actually be many elephants of very different colors all in that room with us all the time. But we occupy a seat of power with respect to our clients, and that's something that we need to be mindful of as we move through it all. And I just want to give a quick shout out to the topic that you will all be discussing next week, because I feel like a lot of this is really going to ground in the culmination of this seven workshop series, which is focused on vicarious trauma, right? And the trauma as providers, but also our past traumas that activate, right, while we are representing people. It's so important. I mean, heck, if they let me, I might sit in on that with you, because I can really use vicarious trauma training these days. Such an important opportunity to sit and think about how it impacts us. And we'll continue to, right? If there's something we can bet, it's going to be that trauma is a regular part of our practice in many different manifestations. And the skills that you're building now and the awareness that you're building is really going to support your practice and you, right? Like, and your wellness moving forward. So let me pause there and see if we're not on. No, I have a little bit more time. Great. I'm going to use these last few minutes to go through the next slide, if that's okay, and talk a little bit about building affirming relationships with clients. So I want you to know that I'm going to leave some minutes at the end. We're going to stop at 10 till, and Shani is going to do the CLE check-in, and we'll take some additional questions at that point. Going to use these last 10 minutes to go over some practices for building affirming relationships with clients. We've been doing it all along. So this might be a little bit of recap, but I think we'll also cover some additional things. So as I move through these guiding principles or these tips for your practice, I really invite you to drop examples of how you've practiced any of these in the chat. And what would be really cool is to give a specific example, like, oh, I did that by doing this, or one way I did that was this, right? I think that there's a lot of wisdom in this room. And almost always a trainer is just there to try to elicit that and to get you all to share it with one another. In a virtual context, that's kind of tough, but I think you've been doing a good job of it so far. So I'll offer up some examples as we move forward, but I'd love to hear yours. So rule number one, right? Know your role, right? And remember who's in charge, because it's not you. Your client is in charge. Your client is the decision maker. You are there to execute on their directive, right? And it is important for you to frame that from the very beginning, for you to make sure that you have communicated to the person that you're working with that the decisions are theirs to make. You are there to inform. You are there to share what you think potential outcomes might be based on different strategies they might choose or decisions they might make, but you are in no way there to make those decisions for them, right? The difference between advice and decision making is that you're not there to tell them what to do. And that, I think, really helps to set up the dynamic that acknowledges the seat of power that they might perceive you to have, and to remind them that they're actually the ones in control, right? And that you're there to advise but not convince, right? So letting them know that from the get is also very important. And it's true in every field of practice, but especially in my practice representing survivors of domestic violence. I think I mentioned earlier, I was very commonly asked like what I thought that they should do. But answering that question, no matter how benevolently a place from which it comes, really is going to undermine everything that I'm hopeful we're accomplishing together, right? Which is, or everything that I hope will result from this court case, which is their safety, their empowerment, their healing. All of that would be really ill-served by me sharing my personal opinion about what decision they should make. So please remember that legal advice is intended to give people strategies for achieving the outcomes they set for themselves, right? Like that, I think, is a golden rule. And then the next thing I wanted to review is that you're a cultural translator, right? We're to the person earlier who said like, don't speak in legalese or break it all down. Yeah, it's legal practice is almost its own country. It has its own language. It has its own customs, right? You might misstep in a way that causes cultural offense in a way, or misstep or bad outcomes in a way that you had not intended. So it's so important to explain the environment and potential foreseeable consequences of all the options available. And just remember, right, like the legal system wasn't built for lay people. It was created to create this sort of, like there is this very difficult barrier, right? And it's meant to be there so that not everybody could go to court and plead a case. If it was easy to plead a case or to articulate a defense or argue the intricacies of precedent, our profession wouldn't exist, right? And that's true even for people who speak English, who hold college degrees. It's really difficult to understand even an uneventful court proceeding. So please do imagine how for marginalized populations, the challenge, how enormous those challenges can be, right? And this was said earlier in one way, but I wanted to just quick repeat. Think of the day in court as a visit to another country, right? With its own language and culture. You're the guide and you're going to explain it all to your clients so that they're never wondering what is going on around them. That wondering, that lack of knowledge is incredibly disempowering and really, really anxiety generating. In addition, I think it's really important to consider how you are withholding your judgment, right? I think we all are very aware of the fact that it's important for us to, you know, fix our face, for us to not show the judgment that we might be feeling. And what I am inviting you to do is to not just work on not showing your judgment, but to work on not having it, right? Like knowing or acknowledging or being honest with yourself when you see that judgment rise up inside of you, when you're feeling it come up and being like, oh, hey, judgment, I see you. Or like, oh, hi, implicit bias. Thanks for that thought. I didn't want that. And really making sure that you're being honest with yourself about when it comes up, right? I think definitely not letting your client see your judgment is a low bar, right? Like we want to go beyond that bar. We want to, in fact, work towards not having that judgment. And it only starts by acknowledging that it's there. And the next bullet point there, being honest about what you can and what you cannot do is so critical. Again, for those of us who came into this work really, really as social justice, you know, advocates, we want so badly to create outcomes that are positive for our clients. And some of the worst roles that we play is as the deliverer of bad news, right? Or when somebody comes in and even from the intake, you know they have no case, or you know that the outcome they want is not something that's going to happen because of the way that everything will get interpreted, because of the way it will appear, just because of the facts, right? And so be very honest about all of that. And what I want to invite you to there is this concept called radical candor, which really invites you to the combination of a practice that is both direct and kind, right? So very often people are like, I'm honest, I tell it like how it is, you know, like I don't beat around the bush, as though that's a really wonderful thing. And I'm not saying it isn't, But when you just tell people how it is without kindness, you've created a real challenging situation around what that truth might be and how they're going to hear it, right? So when you're honest, be honest about what you can and can't do, and be sure that you are activating all of the things that would indicate kindness, right? The tone in your voice, the fact that you are paying attention to them, that your body is turned towards them, and that you're not just like typing, being like, yeah, you got nothing, I'm sorry, like there's no way that we can take that case. Everything about all of the interactions and the nonverbal communications, and if we can just click to that last, I'm sorry, it's not the last one. Yeah, the very last one. Thank you. The nonverbal communications speaks volumes, right? So consider what your office looks like. And again, not judging you. If you need to have if your office is a little bit on what some might identify as the messy side, but I am inviting you to think about what it communicates to your client if they can't find a place to sit because there's papers all over the place. Or if you have very politically charged things around your office that may not be welcoming to them. Or if you have something in a language that they can't understand even, that you think is communicating something good, but it's not communicating a thing because they don't read that language, right? Considering all the nonverbal communications when you're being honest, when you are sharing what the limitations are of the practice. And on holding boundaries, coming back to that one, and you know, boundaries is something I have been working on for the past 20 years of practice, right? When I started, I would invite clients to my home. I remember giving a client a heater, for like a space heater, because her heat was out, and I was working on doing that in housing court, but it wasn't going fast enough. So I had her come over so she can warm up after court and give her my space heater. You know, like there was just all these areas, all these times I remember where boundaries were something that I was really not good at holding. And the thing about holding really great boundaries from the beginning is that you're able to kind of really come back to that and to hold it. And it's much easier to hold a boundary that's well set from the beginning than it is to try to then create a boundary later after you've been practicing without too many of them, right? And your hearts are big, and you know, certainly good intentions creating these bad situations, or not necessarily bad, but in my case that ended up being a bad situation. That was all about having to hold a boundary at the beginning. And what I have here is that you're their advocate, not their friend, right? So even as I am asking you to create all this understanding, I'm not asking you to cross boundaries that go outside of what the attorney-client relationship, what is appropriate to that relationship. It might be that somewhere in the future, a friendship could arise from all of that, right? Like you get to know people really well, and I profoundly respect so many of the clients that I have worked with in the past, would gladly be their friend. But they're probably always going to think of me as their lawyer, right? And that's something that I think is really important to be aware of. One last thing, actually, I'm going to pause right there because we're at time. And if we have time, I'll add anything at the end, but I do want to leave time for questions as well.
Sure, so right before we turn to questions, I'm going to launch the second and last CLE poll for the day. As a reminder, if it doesn't show up on your screen, it's just been launched. Please look in alternate windows. It might just be hidden behind the bigger screen with the training. It's only a yes or no question. And if you have issues with the CLE poll, you don't see it, you didn't respond in time before it disappears, please just email me after, because I send those emails on to the CLE department so that they know what happened. So I'm gonna leave that up, but if it's okay, Margarita, we have gotten a couple of questions around the same thing, and I could pose it to you while this poll is in progress, if that's all right.
Yeah, that sounds great. Great use of time. Thank you.
So one question that we got in a couple of different forms is asking for words and language. How do we acknowledge our privilege? How do we acknowledge these things in a way that sounds natural to our interaction with the client? And I don't know if you have an immediate answer to that. We have some other things in the chat that came through. I'm glad to share that somewhat touch on this as well. But it's a big question. It's a hard question, how to navigate complicated conversations, especially if we haven't been doing it before.
Yeah, you know what I think about natural language? So there's probably nothing really natural about talking about all of this. So I wouldn't worry about sounding cool. I wouldn't worry about sounding smooth, right? Like this is not some pre-recorded episode where, you know, like you perform really well. And the script, even if I gave you one, is not going to be one that's going to apply to every situation. So the one thing I will offer though, is that I think it's really helpful to say things like, there's a complicated conversation that I want to have. I might sound really awkward having it, but I want you to know how important it is to me, what you are going through, and how important it is to me that I not make any accidental or cause any accidental or unintentional harm. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, and then whatever it was that you were thinking through, right? Like, you know, when, I'll just go back to my misgendering example, right? Because Lord knows I have played that over and over, what I should have said and done, right? So the script I think I would have had, you know, is that I'm just going to use a name that is not that person's name, but, you know, Jasenia. I have at this point used the wrong gender pronouns to talk to you twice. I don't want to cause any harm. I understand what your gender identity is, and I honor it. And I want to make sure that you know that I honor it, and to apologize for the way that I didn't in that time, and to ask you, to let you know that I'm going to work hard at not doing it again. But if I did, what's the best way for us to address that, you know? And you don't even have to answer this question. Really, the most important part is the apology. Maybe it's how that would have gone, you know?
Yeah, I think that's such an important point, that sometimes as lawyers we get frozen because we're so focused on words, and words have specific meaning, and words lead to specific actions, and they matter because contract law, and they do. But sometimes in conversations with human beings, you know, there's a balance of like, you know, sometimes I just talk to people like that often what's going to get through anyway is your intent. As long as you're really thoughtful and present, that you're not using harmful language as you're engaging in these conversations, or that if you use harmful language, that you pause, stop, and acknowledge it, as you just kind of gave an example for us that was perfect. That it's really about the messaging and starting the conversation that's going to be getting through. And that in human to human interaction, we're not always so word focused base. Somebody else mentioned that, you know, in the chat that, you know, there's certain things that they know will come up often. And so they have somewhat pre-prepared or over time worked out how to present something where you're not assuming anything of anybody, but opening up space with regards to their prior past experience in the court system, or what they understand or don't understand about what's going on. And so they're specifically a public defender. And so they say, tonight we're here for an arraignment. Do you know what that is? Do you have experience with the criminal justice system? And that the way of putting that together is really not necessarily assuming one thing or another, and allows them to kind of get more information without making those assumptions. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And the only thing I would add to, and thank you for offering up your sort of like the person who's in arraignments, because certainly there's some, that's where you have to have that conversation so often, so many times a night or a shift. When you're asking something or saying something repeatedly, just also be aware that while you might be the 9th or 10th time you've said it that day, that shift, that night, it's the first time the person you're speaking to is hearing it. So do be sure that you are having that conversation every single time like it's the first time, right? Like, and that you're really focused on the answers that somebody's giving you.
Definitely. We do have a couple extra minutes in order to take questions, so do feel free to type them into the chat, or mention if you want to just speak out loud. While we wait for anything in case it comes through, you'll see the slide up here that is the post-session evaluation. You can hold your phone screen up to the barcode type image there, and it will take you directly to the link. I'm also going to put the link for this survey in the chat. I just want you to know that we really do read these. We take into account people's comments. We really appreciate people's feedback. We've been using them to develop all of our future trainings to be mindful of the feedback that we're getting. We do appreciate anybody that can type in. The CLE evaluation will also go out after this. You do have to fill that out in order to get CLE credit. And there will be a link to the Google Drive again, which also has this entire presentation uploaded into it if you didn't have a chance to see it before. One quick note with regards to CLEs, because there were some questions about that. As of the very beginning of next week, a lot of the CLE certificates will be going out. I think as of now, many of the ones from session 1 have gone out for those who have emailed me individually with regards to some issues, seeing the polls or getting quickly signed off or just stepping out of the room. We totally understand that. We've sent that over to our CLE department. Those certificates will be slightly delayed just because of the number that we're issuing. We're kind of doing the ones that we can quickly check off first. So by next week, a lot of people should have received them for the majority of the trainings that have gone on. Before we kind of wrap up and talk about what's going to happen next, I just want to turn it back over to you just in case there is anything else you want to add. We don't have any questions coming in, so I don't know if there was any other points you wanted to make before we close out for the day.
Oh, thank you, Shani. And thank you so much for the role you play in this, Shani. Thank you for sharing everybody's comments when I can't see them. It really helps me to see and know what's going on there. And I also just want to note that there's a lot of people in this room who are brilliant advocates and who I have learned from over the years, and you know who you are. So thank you for all your advocacy and the space you share with me even now, and for being a part of this conversation. I feel like if I start one more thing, I'm going to want to talk for 20 more minutes. So I'll go on ahead and give you 2 minutes out of your afternoon.
But thank you. I want you to know, just so you know, because I am getting all of the chats, that this is not just coming from me. A lot of people have expressed their gratitude, your transparency, the genuineness you brought to this very difficult and very important conversation. So thank you so much, for joining us here today. Everybody in the chat is currently responding with a lot of gratitude, and we share that with them for coming here and doing this presentation, sharing your expertise, your perspective, and your experiences with us so openly. As a reminder for everybody that is here, our next session will be on vicarious trauma. I highly recommend folks attend. It's kind of intrinsic to the work that we do. And it's so important to engage in self-care, especially as the world that's going around us is going around us, and especially as we continue to kind of engage in systems and work within communities that have experienced a lot of trauma. So I hope to see everybody there. The last training session, which is actually going to be on March 19th, you're going to be getting some emails, hopefully, or some links to get some more about. We're going to be diving really into the practice of what about certain case types, what are best strategies, both for working with the client, developing case strategies in response to the reality of the client's traumatic experience, how they're presenting and what they want to do to move forward, and how to engage with the court around that. So we'll be in touch with more of that. We appreciate everybody being here. And I'm just going to end on this quote because I love it so much. Holy cow, what a fantastic training. And yes, it was, Margarita. So thank you so much, everybody. And we will hopefully see many of you next Friday.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Have a restful and restorative weekend.